Hello again, everyone. So in this lesson, we're going to start a new layout module with you. Now, as I spoke about before, we learned table, float, position versus for page layout. Finally, we talked about the Flexbox module, and we saw how easy it makes our work, right? However, CSS is developing, and that means that it allows us to prepare more complex designs easily while preparing our web pages. And Grid CSS also allows two-dimensional changes, making our work even easier in page design. So it also allows us to make changes to both rows and in columns. And we could always make one-dimensional changes in Float and Flexbox. Thus, responsive web development has become a whole lot easier with Grid. However, the grid structure may seem a bit more complex than some of the other modules, when you first have a look at it, but I don't want you to be afraid. What we'll do is we'll be able to prepare more complex pages easier by learning the different finer points of the grid together. All right? So I got you. So let's have a look. So you see here the insight placement with the grid. And grid basically consists of horizontal and vertical grid lines called rows and columns. So by referring to these lines, the placement of the elements that you want to use in your web page shows up on the grid. Now there's some concepts that we'll need to know in the grid before moving on to the coding part. So let's start by learning grid terms. So at first look, let's talk about the grid container and grid item. So actually, it's pretty much the same logic as Flexbox. We have an outer container and child elements inside. Grid container turns the elements it contains into a grid element. Grid line are lines that divide the grid horizontally and vertically. So each grid line gives a number respectively, and it starts numbering from 1. Grid cell. It's the smallest unit of the grid. It's located between 4 grid lines. Grid row. These are structures consisting of horizontal parts. Grid column. They are structures consisting of vertical parts. Grid track. It's used to express the areas between 2 lines. It can be horizontal and vertical, and it's the general term of the grid column or grid row. Grid areas is a structure consisting of a many-grid cell. So we know that every grid element is also a grid area. Grid gap. Yep, there are spaces between column or row. So sure enough, that is all about the grid structure and the terms that we will be using. So I know it's a little bit dry at first, but understanding them is going to be that much easier when we move to the code section, believe me. So if you're confused, don't let it bother you. Confusion is the first step to enlightenment. So in the next lesson, we will start with coding. All right, I'll see you there. Goodbye for now.